Hello, everybody, and welcome to the DXM podcast. I am your host, Colborn. I am joined today by the incredible artist duo Entangled Others. It is a pleasure to have you both here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here.
We start in the same place every time. Would love to learn a bit about you both, how your practices came together, what it means to be Entangled Others, and what brought us together today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, where to start? So I was making art in 2018. 2019. And suddenly one day I see this weird retweet from somebody with a handle Dark Fractures, all in caps.
Very goth. Very gothic.
And I was just like, who is this person? And I click and I open the profile and I see these beautiful 3D scans of trees, and they look like really, really detailed and intricate. I had never seen anything like that, but I was really into photogrammetry at the time. So I wrote them a message, and I think like we instantly kind of connected because we were both interested in finding this place of intersection between like understanding nature or creating kind of an interpretation of nature through a digital context, like visualizing nature in a completely like virtual world. And I think that's kind of where it started for us. And then I introduced Feli to machine learning, which I had been working with.
And generative art in general, actually.
Yeah.
So, I mean, my background is originally architecture. So I originally was working as an architect until about 5 years ago when I sort of had enough and decided, okay, since I had specialized while studying in art and architecture, I figured I'd, try the art bit a bit more. And then, yeah, I've been working a lot, with 3D and these kind of things, and sort of had noticed that like generative art and sort of machine learning was a thing, but had never really quite sort of understood what it was, apart from, it looked interesting. And then I came across Sophia's work. It was just like, wow, this is beautiful. This is like, I have no idea how it's made, but this is gorgeous, And then, of course, once we started talking about that, there was actually, a lot of overlap in the methodology. Like when you go, for example, out 3D scanning, you take thousands and thousands of images just to capture a single tree, for example. And in the same way, you capture, thousands and thousands of images to create a data set. And then you have these very lengthy processing times. There was something about the pacing that was, weirdly familiar in a way. And then, it just kind of became rather a natural kind of click. Pieces sort of fell into place there. And then,
yeah, and then we just kind of started collaborating and right away. And we started with small things, and then I told Feli like, oh, I have this idea that I've been wanting to do for a while. Like I want to create these insects, but I want to make them in 3D. I don't want to make them in 2D anymore. And then Feli was like, okay, let me think about it. And Feli is somebody who's very persistent at a problem. I'm more like I give up if something becomes like too difficult. But he's more like a persistent, very stubborn.
I was waiting for stubborn.
Well, that's his approach. And I remember seeing him like trying to solve a problem that I was like, well, we just don't have the tools to do this in 3D. And one day he's like, I had this idea. I think I know how we can approach this. And then we created the first generation of what became like our first formal collaboration called Artificial Remnants. And that's a project about insectile anatomy. And then we started creating these, AI-generated insects in 3D. And that's kind of where it started for us. So I think we only started calling ourselves Entangled Others in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, it sort of made a lot of sense to sort of formalize things also under sort of a conceptual wrapper, because there were a lot of what we talked about and the ways we wanted to work, with nature, technology, and how we can sort of approach this kind of interesting tangle, as it were. And then we figured, why not, start the studio, also because we wanted it to be, a little bit more fluid and flexible. And yeah, that's what we've been doing ever since, really.
So that's it, basically.
I think there is so much in a name, and this name, Entangled Others, is it's just so incredibly encompassing of the work. So maybe we can just talk a little bit more about the name, and then we'll dive deeper into the practice and the work.
Yeah, I mean, actually, like, it took us, the name was kind of a weird thing, because it was something, we kind of actually spent like throwing the ball back and forwards for a couple of months on that, because we wanted to find something, that had the right kind of, I don't want to use the word hierarchy, but the right kind of balance in it. We wanted to find something which, also encompassed the way we wanted things to be, to work on trying to sort of peel back some of the everyday mundane stuff to show just how entangled we actually are with, the world around us, the modern human world that we, even though a lot of the way we consume technology today, through, for example, a phone with, which has a decidedly platonic interface, sort of with modern interface designs being what they are, it's very easy to see the digital as somehow, a layer above the world that really isn't bound by the same kind of sticky, messy interactions we have. But the reality, of course, is, completely opposite. You press a button, something else happens around the world. There isn't, and sometimes, the other way around, weather or other events suddenly shift in the digital. So actually everything's, really quite tightly knitted together. And I think unless we sort of try and find ways to own that reality is a bit more messy and, not so simple, it's very hard for us to sort of make any sort of concrete steps forwards, because we kind of live in the wrong kind of feedback loop where all the interfaces, everything we see is kind of just nurturing the sense of, being in our own world that isn't, connected to anything else.
So that's basically where the word entangled comes from this kind of invisible connection or invisible link to something. And it was very much inspired as well by this idea of like quantum mechanics as well, entanglement and that concept in itself. And the word others refers to how we kind of look at the natural world in a mundane context, how we very often see, like, for example, insects as, like those weird creatures that we don't fully understand. They don't have a skeleton. They're the other. They're very different to us. And I think a lot of the natural world is like, our relationship with natural world is rooted in a huge misunderstanding. We very often don't understand like other forms of cognition, and we kind of hold everything to the human standard. We think intelligence is this thing that we can do and that other creatures struggle to do.
Yep.
And so we wanted to kind of convey this idea through that word. And these are kind of the more illustrate like the more important aspects of our practice. So we aim to do all our projects around these two main concepts.
I think it's really beautiful, and I think the work absolutely speaks for itself. I remember the early like photogrammetry of the trees, and then the evolution into these kind of like fantastical insects with these beautiful patterns or skins, or it really was unlike anything that I had ever seen. And of course, AI is is very hot right now. But I think the work that you were doing then, it really stood out then and just continues to shine. So maybe you can kind of take the listeners to these early explorations. What was going on with you then? What were you seeking to explore? What were you finding as you created these pieces?
Right. Well, first of all, the landscape of AI art in general was very different back then. There was no Dali, there was no Midjourney. And at least when I started, it was still everything was a lot more bare bone to run. It's still obviously not as bare bone as it was a decade ago, but still it was a very different landscape. So when we started with artificial remnants, for example, what we wanted to do was to talk about biology, and we wanted to talk about insect anatomy, and we wanted to kind of look at the way that we categorize the natural world when we kind of create, these encapsulations, like this is one organ, this is another organ, and there's a functionality. And we wanted to kind of look at that, at that way of interpreting what is happening in our surrounding, and by creating an artificial study of something. So we didn't just want to generate the bug, we also wanted to generate the artificial study of the bug. And that's kind of how it started.
Yeah. And of course, sort of rather quickly, sort of we run into this whole challenge of there just isn't a lot of data, openly available for insects. So the three-dimensional and literature, etc., it was actually quite sparse. So what became quite interesting was that even though we were working with, these fantastically then modern tools, and, cutting edge, so to speak, at the same time, what we are able to generate is really just a very, very, very small kind of space of variation or a sort of diversity. Anytime we generated something we thought was, somehow a bit fantastic or out there, you a few minutes later going on Twitter, if you follow a few insect accounts, then suddenly something comes along and you just see nature has just gone, hold my beer. And it's like this most incredible beetle or something. And you're just like, what? Like this, I cannot even get close to generating anything that's, crazy, diverse and rich. So what was very interesting with that project, and I really kind of hammered it home for, was that what we were able to generate wasn't really a mirror of the reality, but rather it created a mirror of what we knew or was commonly available to us about insectile life. So naturally this kind of became really interesting to see how the data available very much shapes what we perceive, and how the reality of things often is quite different. And that's sort of become one of the red threads, at least for the following project, Beneath the Neural Waves, was this idea that, or sort of realization rather, that a lot of the way we work with these tools isn't so much about creating. We've never had the intention of trying to create a new nature or anything like that, but it's not necessarily the more than human world we're mirroring so much as our human view of that world. And that is, of course, really quite fascinating, because it's still, something really interesting by itself, but it becomes this sort of interesting tension where it's kind of tracing the boundaries of what we know or can imagine. I think that sort of not necessarily on an individual level, but rather in the sort of generalization. And that's, what neural networks, or at least the sort of the architectures we've used, are very good at. They're good at distilling and, extracting essential patterns from data. So
yeah, and back then when we started, we trained a GPT-2 model, and it feels now like vintage almost to say that, because it feels like vintage technology already, but it's not so long ago, really. It's maybe for 3-4 years ago, right?
Yeah, it's about,
So yeah.
I'm curious if there was any, thought about, biodiversity in digital spaces, in the metaverse, obviously populating, these digital spaces with kind of insects or, insectoid life is certainly have never heard that before. I've never seen anybody put bugs in the metaverse. I'm curious if that is important to you at all.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, that was kind of, we've been fascinated by artificial life for a while, especially sort of Sophia really introduced me to the sort of rather rich history of artificial life. And there is absolutely this sort of question, one thing is to create, these sort of virtual organisms, or at least try to. Another thing is what kind of space they inhabit, do they become, like Tamagotchi, or are they somehow, doing their own thing? And we've done some experiments with that. I wouldn't say they're necessarily particularly successful, but we've, for example, augmented reality and these kind of things to try and, have these virtual organisms share some kind of space, but not necessarily in a way where they're in any way interactive. You can't poke or prod them or anything like that, but they just exist. And it was quite interesting to see how, some people still have a very strong reaction to like something insectile, that aversion, but others, who found sort of that they found them quite engaging somehow, it kind of seemed to bypass a little bit that sort of initial reaction. And that sort of led us to think about, sort of consider a bit the potential for digital experiences of nature being, positively formative, that they can perhaps be, a way for us to condition ourselves to, sidestep some of our more instinctual reactions or sort of inherited bias towards the modern human.
Yeah, I had once someone ask me to stop posting on Instagram, like bugs. Any hour, like, can you please just stop? And I was like, unfollow me. Like, you don't have to look at this. But why I found that interesting actually is because a lot of our relationship to insects is based on like fear or disgust. They bring up a lot of these kind of primal emotions or reactions in us. So that's I think it's still important to create a digital representation of nature, as long as it isn't what Felican said, is not nature as a pet or a prop. But I still think that it is important to have like a kind of digital representation of nature in a digital format. So yeah, that's part of your project with the trees was actually digitizing real trees to create like a digital archive of them. They were really, really old, like they were thousands of years old. But I think those are the prime example of the kind of creatures that deserve to be appreciated because they exist in real life. And I think the more that people spend time online or in the metaverse, it is also important for them to create a connection to these beings in a way. So, yeah.
I mean, it's something I fight all the time against, is like the metaverse as a sterile space. Just rectangular boxes, white boxes, traditional galleries. So I think we very much, share that. I want it to be wild. I want it to be uncontrollable. I want it to continue to surprise people. And I think just your work inherently does that.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we can transition a little bit and do you want to talk about AI?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about everything that is happening? Obviously, it's so hot. So many people have had access or have been opened up and given access to these creative tools. Just maybe curious at a very high level your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so we have kind of mixed emotions. Like on one hand, we're happy that the general public is kind of looking at AI art now and that people are talking about it and that the entry barrier has lowered a lot. You know, you don't need to be an AI engineer or, you know, to have a PhD to be able to work with AI anymore.
For the record, neither of us have any sort of coding or engineering background, so we very much had to just like muscle our way through, you know, the difficult bits.
But we're lucky that still, like, even when we started, there were people making efforts to teach about AI online. There was some online content about it. So if we had started it maybe, you know, 4 years before, it would have been much harder to find all that content online to learn. Yeah. But on the other hand, there's a lot of talk about AI consciousness, you know, like this Google engineer saying that his AI became conscious. And, you know, that's the part where I feel, I find it a little bit depressing to think that, you know, we're still debating whether other life forms like if an octopus is conscious or not, but somehow the AI seems for sure to be conscious, you know, and it's just like, sometimes that it makes me feel just sad that, you know, like a technology, just because it's human created, gets this kind of higher hierarchy, and
there's this idea of sort of artificiality being somehow better, and I think so. The democratization of these tools, you know, is incredibly important. I think from the point of view of, if we look at processing, for example, if we rewind, you know, 20 years ago, there was very little available. But thanks to, you know, processing being open and out there, it took, you know, a good 10, 15 years really. But then you see, not just from the West, but from all around the world, these amazing artists emerge who, you know, cut their teeth on processing that because it was openly available, easy to run. Right. The diversity of the digital art space and the visibility, you know, of, you know, non-European or non-US artists suddenly is a lot more balanced. And that I think is also very important, because so far, you know, the barrier to entry has been very high, and of course it's the same problem we have also with VR. VR is, you know, very, very much for those who can afford it, and those who can afford it are very few. And the same has been so far traditionally. So I think like this movement of democratization is very important in that regard. Of course, because a lot of the main development has been, you know, pushed by massive corporations who have insane resources and also have been a little above the law in terms of, you know, how they go about sourcing what they need to create these. This has, of course, led us to our current situation, which is, you know, a bit sticky in that regard, and is, of course, you know, has to be, you know, addressed and preferably dealt with relatively quickly, so that we actually, you know, don't sort of, you know, make AI, you know, capitalism 2.5 as a sort of engine, because that is, you know, hugely problematic. But I think it is a very exciting time, and it's really good to have, you know, such a variety out there. I mean, that has been very nice to see. But I think like this hyper unconsciousness it's a bit misleading, and it's also, you know, I'm very hesitant about it also because it's kind of a cop-out in terms of, you know, being responsible. And I think like that's always been for us very important, you know, like to own like the fact that, you know, if we generate these insectile creatures, that we own the fact that these aren't a one-to-one replica of insect biodiversity out there. You know, they don't even do a fraction of a percentage of the diversity in terms of form and, you know, expression. And it's important to own that. And I think like this personification of these complex systems also makes it very easy to kind of like nudge yourself out of any responsibility for what happens next. And I think that's, you know, I think it's very problematic. And I think, yeah, it's
yeah, in a way, we were saying like it's a strange time to work with AI art. One part of it is really, really nice that the general public now seems to understand a little bit more about it. But at the same time, a lot of misconceptions have like become more accentuated, I think. And there's this whole issue with data sets, of course, like sourcing, from artists who work with traditional media, and that then, their style or their visual identity becomes, just taken and used in these kind of corporate huge models. So, and that's really problematic as well. I totally understand the backlash behind why artists would be mad at that. So there's all this stuff happening, and we're just like, okay, well.
Twitter is getting heated on this.
Well, let's see if I can draw a bit of a thread between all of these. What I hear from you both is both the idea of just like an extension of consciousness to trees, to animal life, to plant life, to expanded consciousness of the individual, to like the recognition of more responsibility and power and willingness to be entangled across these dimensions, and then interest in kind of like the consciousness of the machine, and not kind of like abdicating responsibility to the machine, but also more of a dialogue and a conversation between that. Is that possibly relates, connects?
Nice.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be problematic if we say, like, for example, the machine made it and it's alive and I don't control it.
Yeah.
And I think like that's a very quick way of saying, okay, well, I don't have any work left to do. I cannot fine tune, work on my data set to make it, to improve it. I don't have any work to do with the algorithm to actually improve it. And I think the whole idea of consciousness around AI is just very misleading.
Absolutely. And I think it's also, there's a lot of hype about capability that doesn't really match up. I mean, that's something we were trying to address with the project Critically Extant, where we took the biggest open sort of data set that was sort of like openly sourced and permissible for images of nature. So across some 2.9 million images across 10,000 species. Now, that sounds like a lot, right? 10,000 species. The thing is, we've catalogued about 1.2 million out of what we estimate to be about 8.3 million species on the planet. So, this is a tiny data set. So, but what we tried to do with that is we took the critically endangered species and we constructed a tree, kind of a truncated or a sort of like pruned tree of life with these. We took the tree of life, mapped the critically endangered species, and then we took these 10,000 species that we trained, a then cutting edge model on. And we tried to match, using an algorithmically to map the nearest genetic neighbor on the tree of life to this sort of limited 10,000 tree, as a way of trying to see, because there is so little data about critically endangered species that aren't, pandas, lions, giraffes, whales, the common sort of, very popular species on Instagram. Most of these, often equally, if not far more critical species, they have just a Latin name and a description of when they were last sort of like evaluated, and that's it. So if we sort of take these 10,000 species, and this data available to us now, and try and reconstruct, if we fast forward in time 50 years and then try and reconstruct them if they've all gone extinct, how close can we get to actually being able to like reconstruct a reasonably accurate image? And what it turns out is, most of the time we're not even close. That all this data, all this technology, it's kind of an exercise in futility, because we still know far too little about the world around us. And the technology like a year ago or the technology now isn't going to be enough to change that in any way. It's, at the end of the day, we're still working with high tech, but it's still fundamentally has quite hard limits in what it can do, and there is no sort of silver bullets. So that's also been a part of what we do, is try and sort of not be too sort of lectury about it, but kind of just through the work show also kind of the boundaries of what these things can or can't do, because we need to have some, some balance in it.
Yeah, and this connects somehow to a project that we have upcoming this year where we're collaborating with a team. One of them is a biologist and the other one is an art director. They're based in Brazil. And together we applied for a grant to the Amazonas and rainforest. And a lot of their work is focused on cataloging new species of praying mantis in the Amazonas. And we think it's amazing that, they are going out into the wild completely, and they are working on cataloging all these new species and trying to understand, because it's such a dense environment. Like there are so many different species that we still haven't cataloged at all. We have no idea they even exist. So it's just to us, like that aspect of connecting to the data, where it comes from, and who is actually working on cataloging that data became more and more important. And we want to really connect our work to that. So yeah, that's something we're excited about.
Two things. One, I work for an organization, nonprofit called the Rainforest Partnership, and they're constantly out there finding new frogs, new snakes.
Oh, really?
So I'd love to connect you if you'd like to just kind of bring those into the data set. They're super
Yeah.
wonderful and kind people. And the second point, I think, is, what always scared me about like Chat GPT, of course, was just this decentralized single answer, right? And when you talk about like bias ingrained in models, well, of course, this is always going to have like, it's going to have a Western bias. It's going to have like, where is the processing power? It's going to really continue to just like favor the victors who have written history.
Exactly.
And I think people, very much take a lot of this, and I think the way it's being presented is as fact. You kind of lose the variability of that Google search if that even exists, or at least the presentation of the information in that way.
Yeah, exactly. A huge part of it is presentation.
True.
Yeah.
And it's also it's important to remember that there is a lot of creative space, sort of creating novel, kind of recombinations of latent points within a model space. But ultimately, you do run into quite hard limits in terms of data in, data out. What you give is what you get in that regard. And that's also very important when we're sort of trying to imagine something new. For example, I see this a lot with architecture right now, which is having sort of an AI moment, it's by the looks of it. And there it's sort of, a lot of these tools sort of get, wholesale adopted because they create images very quickly. And, with architecture, it's usually a very slow process to get to the point where you have a flashy image, right? The problem is that most of these image models or ChatGPT, what have you, don't necessarily have much specific, updated, or even, good knowledge about, for example, more ecological green architecture or ways of seeing the world or the modern human world. So basically what you're working with is kind of a distillation of what's already there, which, frankly, has gotten us into a fair bit of mess already now. And that's also one of these sort of worrisome aspects, that if we don't find ways to, critically engage in what kind of world do we want, and how do we shape these tools and adjust them so that they can also help us towards something new or something different, we're going to I'm worried we end up in the same situation as Netflix is right now, where we kind of like gone into an algorithmic spiral of the regurgitating the same until the point of, it's basically, collapsing in upon itself, because it's entirely predictable, it's entirely boring, and it hasn't really managed to sort of nurture something different within it. Anyway, end of rant.
Look, I think that's a super point. I am obsessed with how all of this is just trending us broadly towards like mediocrity. Nothing new, everything just the same, regurgitated. How the algorithm conditions you to be the same as you were yesterday. It doesn't allow you to break free. It doesn't allow you to create anything new. People might feel like it's feeding them new images, but again, if it's not leading to anything, it just kind of drives everybody into the same thing, like global capitalism creating monoculture. Everywhere you go, everything the same, everybody has access to the same thing. And really, what does that create but like stability? And that for me is pretty scary.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of something we actually sort of experienced quite early on with the project Beneath Neural Waves, where we wanted to not just generate single specimens, but try and generate a small ecosystem. And for us, a natural choice became coral reefs, because they're kind of this crucial ecosystem for biodiversity, but they cover such a small percentage of the ocean floors. The thing was, though, there was just no data. So in the end, we had to sort of enlist the help of a fellow artist, Joel Simon, who's done a lot of work with genetic algorithms to grow, based upon, observations of coral, grow three-dimensional coral we could use as a data set. So it was interesting for us still, you could call it a failure, but we thought it was quite interesting to map out what we knew about corals. But the fact of the matter was that there just wasn't data available about something that, everybody knows what a coral reef is, but there's no data available. So anything we could generate is more a reflection of our knowledge, not of the actual reality and the actual diversity of it. And well, this problem kind of becomes both a lot harder to grasp, but also far more, all-encompassing, with these new generations of, incredibly large models, incredibly huge data sets, but we still fundamentally face that problem again and again.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that with time, and not just for our purpose, which is art, and it doesn't have anything like inherently scientific about it in its goal, but for biologists and researchers in general, like I really hope that we get better data sets and better open source data sets that can be used, because it's very limited. Like, of course, there are more and more open source efforts, but it's still like all very, very limited in what you can access. Yeah.
We've danced around it. We haven't really touched it. I'm curious, having gone through a cycle, having sold art on both sides of this now, how do you feel about NFTs?
Oh.
I don't know, my personal perspective is I kind of see it kind of like selling a print, or a sculpture. It's one way of, allowing people to collect your work and, perhaps more importantly, allow us to sort of manage to keep actually making art, full time.
Yeah.
It's not like we've gotten rich off it or anything, but, we've been able to now actually do this for a couple of years, sort of full time as a studio, and we feel like super lucky to do that.
I think we wouldn't possibly, maybe we would still be doing this, but we wouldn't be able to have the capacity to say no to projects. We would have to make a lot more compromises, and thanks to that, we've been able to say no, we want to pursue the projects that are important to us. And when we started putting our work out as NFTs, we were very, we didn't know. We were really uncertain about what would happen, what would this ecosystem become, and it seemed, in my opinion, just very different to what it is now. If anything, I think it has grown a lot. There are a lot of things that I like much more now about it. It seems much more open to everyone. There seems to be a lot more focus on inclusivity, and having diversity of voices, and that's a big thing. but at the same time, sometimes like I do get overwhelmed. Things go very fast, and it's still like important for us to take a step back and say like, well, this is as much work as I can release for now. I need to like take my time to think about what I want to do and to be purposeful about it.
The pace of things has been a bit daunting at times, especially because a lot of our projects sort of exist on a sort of half a year to a year scale. I mean, we now finally have soon releasing something that's been sort of cooking for about half a year, and I would say like this sort of finally being exhibited now after half a year, but really it's still probably another half a year before it's kind of reached.
Well, it was 2 years that we've been thinking about the project.
So it's like a lot of our work isn't really sort of a very quick thing. It takes a lot of time, a lot of research, a lot of experimentation. And of course, that is quite at odds at the pace of things. So for us, that's sometimes been a bit jarring, this kind of like, hey, we'd like you to do an online exhibition next week, can you provide like 100 pieces? And we're like, well, about that. So that's kind of like, that's one thing. But I mean, I think it's been good to space in some ways, especially, you can't really avoid the fact that, if it hadn't been for that, the pandemic would have been a lot harder for a lot of artists.
Yeah.
We know ourselves and a lot of artists just wouldn't have pulled through as artists through that. And that's that, for better or for worse, that was, one very good thing that, a lot of our peers and ourselves were able to make it through due to that. But I think also they're no silver bullet by themselves, and nor do they sort of, necessarily imply anything better than was, unless we actually, keep taking the time and energy and keep pushing to build more diverse, more balanced platforms, and, are able to sort of try and embody, better, healthier values for, the whole ecosystem, because a lot of the ecosystem has been around Twitter, which, at times can be also a little, not necessarily the most nurturing environment for new artists coming on, stepping out into the world. So there's this sort of, it's always a balance, I think, to be practiced. I don't think we're ever going to really get there, but I think we, if we keep trying, we'll get somewhere.
Well, yeah, we need to remain hopeful about it. Otherwise,
absolutely, yeah.
I think it definitely helped us a lot. Like there was a time, so my first NFT was released in January 2020. And since then to now, well, there's been a lot of, ups and downs, of course. And also for us, like I had moments where back before the Ethereum merge, there was a time that people got really, really mad, and especially at artists who have a focus on nature and releasing NFTs. And, I remember there was a time where people were chasing me on my DMs, like telling me, like, what a hypocrite you are, why are you doing this, like attacking me. And that was a very weird time, to be releasing work in NFT format.
But, there was also rent to be paid, and food to be bought. So
and it was a very difficult conversation to have in a way, how do I explain that, like we don't exist in a vacuum. And then, like the good times where people are more interested in buying work, and then suddenly it's a crypto crash, and then like, it's like, and then how to psychologically deal with all these, the market, like supply and demand, and what does it mean if my artwork is worth more or less? And, for some artists that has been like really a lot to deal with, like their works are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars overnight. And then, overnight they're worth less. And it's all this stuff to psychologically navigate as well. which it might not look like it has an impact, but it has an impact on artists because
yeah, that's a huge administrative overhead, the sort of, because of the way the space was set up early on, with the sort of kind of anti-gallery movement, the normal figures who would have been there to sort of, soften a lot of that kind of complex logistics and networking, etc., that normally a gallery does, was entirely not there. So there was, this bit of a, and still is, very much a chaotic space in terms of how many factors you're supposed to be somehow on top of and understanding, whilst at the same time hopefully producing something new and good. And I think, at least I feel quite lucky to have, been making art that nobody saw or collected, from way before NFTs were a thing, purely because for me it's like I'm going to do it anyway. I just, I'm trying to find that balance in my practice so that I can keep doing, this in 30 years' time, because I have several notebooks with more than enough projects to fill that duration. So it's not like I've plenty to do, in that regard. So I think it's more like the sort of long-term view, I think, is still very much missing in the space. Like, will everyone, still be able to be around in 20, 30 years' time doing their thing? Like, how do we balance that sort of short-term up-down with, more long-term thinking? Because I think that's also going to be ultimately quite important for, those to come and after us as well.
Yeah, but something that I'm grateful for is that there are conversations being had. For example, the issue with the royalties, like maybe years ago, like before NFTs were popular and everything, that's an issue that artists and galleries would know about, but it wouldn't be talked in the mainstream, or there wouldn't be like these massive discussions about that. And something that I am grateful to see is that, so many collectors have stepped up in favor of that, and, that people know that that's an issue, even if there are people like obviously actively against royalties for artists. But I'm just glad that the conversations are being had, Yeah.
Well, we are just getting warmed up here, but
Yeah.
fortunately we're out of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll have to bring you back at some point. But I'm super, super grateful for the time. Please, let people know any last words that you might have, where they might be able to find you, websites, socials, anything you'd like.
Yeah, so we are Entangled Others on Instagram and Twitter. I am Sofia Crespo, so I'm also on Instagram, Twitter, and Feli as well, under his different handles.
Yeah, exactly.
Felican.McCormick and Entangled Light.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
You ditched all the dark gothic ones.
Yeah. No.
Just a phase, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was very much into sort of Dark Ecology by Timothy Morton and sort of that kind of philosophical wrapper to it. So it wasn't entirely as goth as it sounds.
It was still pretty goth.
What can I say? Yeah, so yeah.
So yeah,
All right, let's get out of here. Thank you both. Yeah, I'm Colborn Bell. Thank you, DMINTI, Entangled Others. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And it's always a pleasure. Until next time.
Thank you. Thank you for
Until
having
next
us.
time. Bye-bye.
Breaking news.